Welcome back to Business Ethics. I'm Tom, and this video is discussing three special stakeholders, which is society, the environment, and the government. Now, my notes don't correspond exactly to the reading. I try to pick and choose some things that I think are important. But to take us back to the kind of original picture of what a ethical business is supposed to look like, we mentioned that business ethics really has to do with this idea of corporate social responsibility, right? Trying to make thinking of your business as making a positive impact, contributing to the social good, right? And the kind of buzzword or acronym or whatever for that is CSR, right? Corporate social responsibility. However, in recent years, that has shifted, and there's kind of a new cool term to use, which is ESG. And ESG is stands for environment, society, and corporate governance, right? And so corporate governance is less about the government, the capital G government, and more about how you structure and implement that structure in your business, right? Corporate governance. Um, ESG is kind of the hot thing, and it's gotten in the news fairly recently in terms of the constraint it puts on businesses and whether or not businesses can make decisions based on ESG considerations, right, or social responsibility considerations. And we'll talk about what the pushback on that would look like. But of course, the debate around corporate social responsibility is that, on the one hand, many people think that it's very important, um, and that companies have an obligation to do right by society, to not, overuse and destroy the environment, and they have an obligation to create a safe and healthy working place and all that kind of stuff, right? Um, but the alternative view is that really companies should not be focused on that. They should be focused on being a viable company, and that means turning a profit, right? And that focusing on their kind of social responsibilities can take away from that profitability. And so that kind of alternative view is one that's called shareholder primacy, right? And shareholder primacy is the idea that shareholders kind of should be the most important stakeholder, right? And the reason why really is one way to think about this is that, you know, um, as an investor, you give money to a company, right? And the implicit agreement there is that that company will give you more money than you gave them, right? So if I invest $1,000 in a company, the reason why is because I'm expecting 1,100 back, right? That's how it's working. Now, of course, I'm not guaranteed that for sure. There's always a risk when you invest, but nonetheless, that's the implicit agreement, right? And so maybe the business flops, a competitor shows up, market goes wonky, whatever, and that happens. But if I give that money to the company and then they completely change their business model like that, and their business model is to, I don't know, start planting trees instead of selling cars, you'd be like, that's seems like you're kind of not fulfilling the commitment, right? Like I wouldn't have invested in you if I knew you were going to make these kinds of decisions. And that's the idea behind shareholder primacy, that executives have an obligation to focus on profits, to maximize profits, right? And that's because they have lots and lots of investors that have given them lots of money, and the implicit agreement was that they would be making money and they would hold to their business model to a certain degree, right? Now, there are some interesting cases about this. And in fact, I think the Supreme Court had ruled in favor of this kind of shareholder primacy view. One particular case they mention is with Henry Ford. He felt like his business was Ford Motors, right? Was perfectly profitable. and they were making plenty of money, and so he wanted to reinvest that into the community, and into working conditions, and he actually wanted to actually lower the cost of cars, make it more affordable. Um, and some investors sued him, and they said, you're not holding to, you don't have the right to make these kinds of decisions with our money. And the court ruled in their favor. And the investor, as it turns out, was the Dodge brothers, Dodge Motors, right? But nonetheless, that's the tension there, right? And then the other case, they talked about Wrigley Field, the Wrigley family, and they didn't want to put lights in the field, if I remember correctly, and because they thought it would promote crime or something like this in the area, north side of Chicago, and and they were, but it was taking money away from them because they couldn't have night games, and the investors wanted them to install the lights, and I think they held off, and the court ruled in their favor, right, that they could make that decision. Um, there's also a case with Hobby Lobby, where they decided that they did not want to pay for contraception in terms of the health care programs, and that they offered employees. And the Supreme Court ruled in their favor, right? Again, that's taking up a social issue, and one that could potentially hurt the company. And so in that case, you might think shareholder primacy requires them to kind of to not pursue that kind of social agenda, right? So there's really, kind of back and forth on this, right? So um, that's really kind of like the social angle of this, right? The environment angle, with this class, we just don't have enough time to really get into it. I also teach environmental ethics if you're interested. But with the environment, I think a lot of us agree that there is some kind of implicit um, ethical consideration for being conservative with resources, and basically being good to the environment. There is difficulty understanding exactly what that amounts to, right? In terms of who or what are your ethical obligations to? And this is the big debate about environmental ethics, right? Do we really have ethical obligations to the environment itself, or is our ethical obligation really to other people in the community to not ruin their drinking water or whatnot? Or is our ethical obligation to future generations? Or is it an ethical obligation to ourselves, to not ruin the planet that we live on, right? And so, how to kind of ground that idea? Where do our ethical obligations really reside? That's a difficult question to answer, right? And how that pans out in the business arena, is a large question, right? And then the last one, with the government, right? The thing to mention about, or the kind of big takeaway that I talk about, are all these government agencies: Consumer Protection Bureau, the Securities and Exchange Commission, there's all kinds of entities that are really aiding business, right? And constricting it in certain ways, and providing subsidies in other ones, and tax breaks in other areas. The fact is that the government does have its hand in business quite a bit, and that has happened over time, right? And out of necessity, right? Everything from the Great Depression on, and probably before that, right? Um, and so it's important to recognize that this idea of the free market kind of taking care of itself just empirically has not been true. It just hasn't been true as a matter of fact, right? And that the market left to its own devices has created a lot of social problems, right? And so if you're looking at the profit first versus purpose first kind of debate, I think it's worth noting that there are a number of instances where the kind of profit first model has led to a lot of big troubles, right? And right or wrong, it's just some kind of ammunition in that line of reasoning if you want to go like an anti-profit first orientation, right? That kind of view, if you're suspicious of a profit first um, um, position. Right? So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and we will talk soon. Thanks.